Hello everyone. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the cell. If you recall from our last lecture, we discussed Louis Pasteur's famous experiments using the swan-necked flasks. It was Pasteur who came up with the conclusion that all life can only come from other life. In other words, it was Pasteur who disproved the theory of spontaneous generation that had been so popular for such a long time. His work, along with the work of many other scientists, led to the development of what we now call the cell theory. And different source materials will describe the cell theory a little bit differently, but I would like us to learn it as two statements. Number one, that all living organisms are composed of cells. And number two, that all cells come from other cells, from pre-existing cells. So cells cannot come out of thin air. They cannot arise spontaneously. They have to come from some kind of process of division of other cells. And it is the cell that is sort of the fundamental subunit of all living things on our planet. Now, when we examine living things in the three domains, we're going to find lots of different types of cells, lots of different sizes and different shapes. They're going to have different internal structures, different types of molecules within them. But all cells share a certain number of things in common. And what I've listed here are the four things that all cells have. So if it's a cell, and if it's on planet Earth, it has these four things. Number one, it's surrounded by a membrane. And we're going to talk a little bit about membranes today and what they're composed of. Number two, inside that membrane, inside the cell, there's a material called cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is actually not really a liquid. It's more like a gel. And all cells are full of this sort of gelatinous material. All cells use DNA as their genetic material. They use DNA to store their genetic information. And finally, all cells contain ribosomes. And ribosomes are the cellular machinery that is used to produce protein. I have a little note at the bottom of this slide that ribosomes are not organelles. Remember, we said the primary difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell is the presence of organelles. Eukaryotes have them, prokaryotes don't. We're going to talk about organelles today in some detail, but ribosomes simply can't be organelles, correct? If all cells have ribosomes, then we know that ribosomes don't fall into the category of organelles. On this slide, there are some drawings of lots of different types of cells. If you start over on the right-hand side of the slide, these are some drawings of microscopic prokaryotic cells. And remember, we said the prokaryotes contain two domains, the bacteria and the archaea. So we're looking at single-celled microscopic organisms in this drawing. Notice that there's an array of different shapes here, but it's not a huge array. We don't see a tremendous amount of variation in the shape of prokaryotic cells. We see a lot of circular or spherical cells. We see some of those spherical cells lining up one next to the other. We see some spiral or helical shaped cells. We see some rod shaped cells. but really not too much of an array of size and shape. Compare that with the drawings over on the left-hand side. These represent just a handful of eukaryotic cells. This is where we see a tremendous diversity in size and in shape. We go from the tiniest microscopic diatom, a paramecium that might be found swimming in a freshwater lake, to a very specialized, very unusual looking neuron that you might pull out of an animal with its very strange, almost alien looking projections coming off of the membrane surface. And if you recall from your anatomy, these are called dendrites. This is a highly specialized eukaryotic cell that is used for electrical transmissions in the nervous system. Above it, we can see a group of muscle cells, or skeletal muscle cells. Remember, we call these muscle fibers because they have this very strange elongated shape. You can tell that there are 3 individual cells here because each cell has its own nucleus. But this is a great example of the shape of a cell being related to its function, to its job. Muscle fibers have the job of contraction and then relaxation. And in order to do that job as well as they can, they have to have that elongated shape. Red blood cells have a very peculiar shape, as you know. They have that dimple in the center. Red blood cells have that dimple for one reason. They are responsible for transporting gases, oxygen gas, carbon dioxide gas, in and out of the bloodstream. And that dimple helps increase the surface area of the cell and therefore makes gas exchange more efficient. Again, the function of a cell is very closely tied to its shape in a eukaryote. There's a drawing here of a pore on a leaf that you would find on a green plant. These are called guard cells, and they literally open and close at different times of day and in different weather conditions to control what's going in and out of that leaf. Just a tremendous variety in both size and shape in eukaryotic cells, and it's tied to function. Now, it's different for the prokaryotes because in a prokaryote, the cell is the organism. There's only one cell that makes up the whole organism, so you don't see the connection between shape and function in a prokaryote. So, if we look around the planet, all of the cells fall into one of 2 groups: prokaryote or eukaryote. The prokaryote includes all of the organisms in the bacteria domain and the archaea domain. These organisms have no organelles, so they have no nucleus, no organelles. They also are lacking a cytoskeleton. Now, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the cytoskeleton is a really critical component of eukaryotic cell function, and the cytoskeleton has important jobs to do in a living cell. Prokaryotes don't have a cytoskeleton. They have something sort of like a primitive version of the cytoskeleton, but they don't have a true cytoskeleton, if you will. Eukaryotes are organisms that fall into the eukarya domain. That's an easy one to remember. Eukaryotes contain organelles. That's one of their key features, structural features. Now, what exactly is an organelle? When we use that term, what exactly are we referring to? If you translate the word organelle It means little organ. So if you think about the organs inside your body and how each organ has its own particular physiology, it has its own particular job to do. Organelles are very similar. Each organelle inside a eukaryotic cell has a specific job to do, a specific function or short list of functions that it does for the cell. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the advance of having organelles is the ability of a cell to compartmentalize certain jobs. Instead of the whole cell doing all of the work all of the time, in a eukaryotic cell, individual jobs, individual functions are taken care of by different organelles. Eukaryotes also have a true cytoskeleton. Now again, the cytoskeleton does a couple of different jobs for the cell, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But for now, understand that the cytoskeleton is this very complex network of different proteins, and these proteins are shaped like filaments. They're shaped like linear filaments, and they help really give a cell its shape and also its flexibility. We'll talk a little bit more about them in just a few minutes. You've seen this slide before. You've seen the drawing of a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. That's what's on the left side of the slide. And then the electron microscope images of those two types of cells. Prokaryotic on the top, eukaryotic on the bottom. This is a transmission electron microscope image. We know that because we can see the internal details of these cells. So remember, when we think about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, prokaryotic cells are smaller. If you recall the scale that we looked at in our Introduction to the Microbes lecture, we're talking about maybe 0.5 up to maybe 2 or 3 micrometers. So this rod-shaped cell might be 2 micrometers long. And this eukaryotic cell, with all of its organelles inside, this could be maybe 10 micrometers or 15 micrometers, a much bigger cell. Now why? Why are eukaryotic cells bigger? Well, they have to be bigger. They're full of these membrane-bound compartments that we call organelles. So they just have a greater structural complexity, and therefore they have a bigger size. We can look at this drawing and we can know that this is an animal cell as opposed to a plant cell. And the reason we know that is because there's no cell wall in this drawing. There's no straight, firm, stiff cell walls around this cell. So we typically draw animal cells as being circular, even though, as I said a minute ago, they vary tremendously in their shape. But when we're drawing them, we sort of draw this generic circular cell to show that it's just surrounded by this soft membrane and not by a rigid cell wall. When we draw a plant cell in comparison, we typically draw it as a rectangle to show that, again, that rigid cell wall structure. Remember, it doesn't matter if you're talking about a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell. There is a list of 4 things that we're going to find in both cells. In fact, in all cells. That list is important for us to know. Cell membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes.